What does it mean to be engaged in your learning? When superficially understood, engagement refers to the level of involvement and participation that students have in their own learning process. But that's an impoverished view of engagement. In today's podcast, we're going to take our understanding of student engagement to the next level with my guest and friend, Dr. Amy Berry. Amy is a research fellow at the Australian Council for Educational Research and an honorary fellow at the University of Melbourne. Her career began as a primary school teacher in Queensland before returning to university to complete a research Masters of Education, where she began to develop her ideas about what it means to be engaged in learning. Having sparked her passion, Amy went on to complete her doctoral studies, where she explored teacher perspectives on student engagement and their approaches to engaging students in the classroom. Amy has extensive experience working with pre-service and practicing educators all over the world and has spent the last 10 years trying to help educators hone their skills in classroom-based assessment, play-based learning, evidence-based practice, and student engagement in learning. I really hope you find value in listening to this Powerful Learning podcast as we join Dr. Amy Berry on an adventure that challenges us to reimagine student engagement. G'day and welcome to the Powerful Learning Podcast, where our mission is to help you know more, do more and be more by delving into the science of effective learning and teaching. My name's Luke Rowe and I'm a university lecturer and researcher who specialises in evidence-based teaching and the science of learning. In today's podcast, we'll be tackling the topic of engagement in learning with author, researcher and educational consultant Dr. Amy Berry. We'll cover plenty of topics, including various conceptions and misconceptions about student engagement, what it means to be passively disengaged, and why this is such an insidious and pervasive trend in classrooms. We'll unpack Amy's continuum of student engagement and wrestle with the daunting challenges associated with raising the level of engagement that students have in classroom learning. If this podcast piques your interest, don't forget to subscribe so that you can be notified of future episodes. And please leave us a review so that others can discover our material and join the Powerful Learning community. So without further ado, I bring you my discussion with Dr. Amy Berry. Good to see you, Amy Berry. Thanks for coming to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, for those of you who don't know, Amy Berry has just written a book called Reimagining Student Engagement from Disrupting to Driving, and it's a 2022 release from Corwin Press. And I have enjoyed reading that book, and it's got me super excited for today's podcast. So tell me, what inspired you to write the book, and who's it for?
Well, the book is definitely for teachers and school leaders, people that work within schools. And I think it's probably also of interest to people who teach teachers and like yourself. It really, the reason why I wrote the book was my continuing dissatisfaction with the existing support for teachers and people working in schools in relation to improving student engagement. So this is something we've been working on for decades. And yet we don't seem to be making any headway at all in improving this situation. In fact, there are many people who will argue that we're actually going backwards rather than forwards in terms of getting our students to be more engaged in what's happening at school. And so that was always in my mind, that this is something that was really needed. And the book itself was always something that I thought about and wanted to do. I just hadn't quite got around to it. I had some ideas bubbling away. I had some kind of beginnings of a draft or an outline, but it wasn't really going anywhere until 2020. And what happened in 2020 was the continuum of engagement that the book is based on was featured in a book called The Distance Learning Playbook that got out in the US from Corwin. John Hattie, Doug Fisher, and Nancy Frey wrote that. And instead of using the normal multi-dimensional, three-dimensional framework for engagement, so behavioral engagement, emotional engagement, and cognitive engagement, they decided to go with my continuum instead. And for that reason, it started to get a lot of airplay in the US. So it was picked up by a couple of blogs and written about. The teachers started to pick it up and try to use it in their classrooms. I started to get some contact from teachers over there. So I had an art teacher reach out to me to say, I love the continuum. I'm using it. I made posters of each of the different forms, and I'm having, I have them in my classroom and we refer to them all the time. And all my colleagues wanted them as well. So now I've got, I'm making them for them as well. So that kind of just spurred me on and went, okay, come on, I got to write this book. And I got.
Oh yeah, when you become a poster in a classroom, I mean, you're ready to write a book. That's got to be one of the benchmarks you've got to surpass to be able to be worthy of writing a book. How humbling was that to hear that your work had traction with teachers in classrooms on the other side of the world?
It was surreal, actually. I still, kind of pinch myself and think, how did this happen? I guess it was very satisfying because my whole point was trying to represent the teacher's voice in all of this, the space where their voice was often silent. Yeah. And so I guess it was a little bit of validation that maybe I did it well, I captured it the right way. I didn't do wrong by them. So and that's the kind of impression I got from reading your book, was that I thought, oh my goodness, this is written so well, and it's written with the teachers in mind from their perspective. You're so grounded in the perspectives of teachers when you write this, that you approach complex topics in quite an accessible and simple way without being simplistic. You don't trivialize complex topics, but you make them very accessible and easily translated into classroom practice. And that's something I really enjoyed, because so many books don't do that. They are written for teachers, but when you open them, it's like a different language. Teachers don't speak that academic jargon. And there's a lot of heavy lifting that you've done just to be able to make it this accessible. And I can appreciate that when I read that. So it was just a beautiful, easy read because of that. Well, it's good to hear that, because that was one of my main aims. I think this is often the problem. You're right. The translation falls apart. It can be great research. It can be have great potential, but when we fall down at the translation hurdle, it goes nowhere. And that's part of the problem that we faced with engagement. There's an absolute mountain of research around student engagement, but getting it translated to an accessible format that teachers can do something with.
Engaging teachers with the topic of engagement.
Yeah.
Challenge. Tell me a bit about the conceptual notion of engagement. Give me a conceptual overview of what engagement means in the book, and why is it so relevant to educators?
Engagement as a concept has received a lot of attention for decades now, and there's no sign of it going anywhere anytime soon. The reason why it is so important and receives so much attention is, one, it has been repeatedly and consistently linked with outcomes that we value in education. So things like achievement, things like academic success, and also well-being. And, disengagement, the other side of the coin, has been linked to things that we, desperately want to avoid, things like dropout, depression, poor mental health, and engaging in risky behaviors like drug taking and things like that. So and we saw a lot of that, and the lockdowns were particularly a catalyst for pushing people in that direction. Yeah. And then the other reason why we're interested in it is because it is also malleable. We know that it has that we as teachers have the ability to influence engagement. Yeah. Because of that, it's kind of been positioned as this really valued lever for people who are working within schools who want to improve certain outcomes for their students. So that's why I think there's so much attention on it. It's in that potential space. So realize the potential, but that's interesting. That's it. So there's a nuance there, because sometimes people would look at the notion of engagement as an outcome that is desirable in and of itself. But what you're saying is that it's got value because of what it also allows you to achieve. So, what's your perspective on that? Do you think
I have read a recent blog post, actually, can't remember who it was by, but they were saying engagement is not the goal in the teacher's classroom, and don't get stuck and hung up on the notion of engagement being your goal. It's the means to the learning, right? So, but is that a false dichotomy? Is it that you can have and want both?
You highlight one of the many problems that we face when we're working in this space. And it has for many, it has become the end goal itself, like the engagement is the goal, and the link between engagement and learning, or the link between engagement and well-being, is kind of lost. I would say it's not even implicit. It's just completely off the radar.
Yeah.
So people kind of forget the reason why we became interested in engagement in the first place. And this really has led to a lot of unhelpful misconceptions in my mind. One is that if we keep, engagement is about getting students busy doing stuff. This is a big one. As long as they're busy and they're active and doing stuff in the classroom, well, that means they must be engaged. Tick, my job is done. But, we know that there can be a whole lot of doing going on in a classroom with very little learning happening as a result.
Yeah.
So that's one major issue that we have when we lose sight of the connection between engaging and learning. I mean, you've got to engage in something. It's not, that's how it works. So in my work, I'm really specific and explicit about my interest. My interest and my focus is on engaging in learning, engaging in the process of learning.
Yeah. And
so that means something quite different than being engaged in the social institution that is school. So turning up to school, taking part in activities that happen at school, having relationships with people in school. That's a different kind of engagement. They're related, but they're not the same thing. And because we haven't been explicit about this in the past, I can understand why teachers get very confused about what it is they're trying, what's the goal here, what am I trying to achieve? And I often get schools come to me, wanting to improve their engagement, and they say, well, our students are really compliant. And it's a really interesting conversation. It happens to me all the time. It's a really interesting conversation to have because, my first instinct is, well, isn't that a good thing? Like, are you saying you want non-compliant students? We want students to be compliant to some degree because otherwise there'll be chaos in the school.
Yeah.
So we have norms and things that we expect them to abide by and all of that. But, after a few of these conversations, I soon realized, well, what they're meaning is our students are passive. And that's what we don't like.
Right.
They're passively compliant. And what they want is for them to care more, to be more actively engaged, to want to learn more, and to want to kind of take the reins and do it themselves a bit more. So it's an interesting thing. And, that's why I think the title of the book, Reimagining Student Engagement, this is what we need to do. We need to shift the narrative and our ideas about what it means to be engaged as a student at school.
From that carrot and stick compliance model.
Yeah.
That's the kind of behaviorist notion. You've got these positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers, and that's just the mechanistic aspects of the classroom that, as a teacher, you can put your hands on those controls and, and it all works, apparently. Before we go on, I think it's worth just expanding on this continuum of student engagement, because I think, look, it's one of the highlights of the book. It obviously captured a lot of interest in this distance learning playbook is that what it's called? Distance learning playbook? Yeah, distance learning playbook that was written by Hattie and colleagues. So it's a real highlight there, but it's tucked away. I can't remember. I'm trying to look for which page it's on now, but it's quite deep in the book. But I think it's worth getting our minds wrapped around that notion of the continuum of student engagement before we go on, because it helps us make sense of the rest of this discussion.
Yep.
So expand on that a little bit.
Okay, so I'll back up a tiny bit to tell you how it came to be.
Oh, there it is, page 16.
Well, it's not that deep, thank goodness.
Not that deep. I was like, oh yeah, it's actually not that deep. But yeah.
In my research, I became very familiar with the existing and more popular frameworks for engagement that you will often see in educational research studies, but also in policy documents. So if you go look up a policy around student engagement for, something like the Victorian Department of Education, you'll generally see them refer to this three-dimensional model of engagement, which talks about behavioral engagement, emotional engagement, and cognitive engagement.
Yeah.
And so in my work, I was like, okay, well, that's all well and good. I understand why educational psychologists prefer this model. I understand why they've gone down this path. But for me, I had this feeling like, yeah, but I don't know. Does it work for teachers? Like, is maybe this the sticking point? Is this how we think about engagement? I don't think so. So I went to teachers and asked them to describe engagement. And from those conversations, those interviews, all of those, I was able to come up with, okay, well, they do have a rich understanding of engagement that's very different from how educational psychologists are talking about it. And it lent itself more to this kind of continuum of engagement. And so in the continuum, there are 3 forms of disengagement and 3 forms of engagement. Disengaged, and they range from passive forms to more active forms. So when it comes to disengagement, we've got the most active form is disrupting, and teachers or anybody who's spent time in schools will, be familiar with this. This is the most in-your-face kind of form of disengagement. They're arguing, they're fighting, they're creating a disruption within.
So they're actively undermining your efforts to help others learn.
It's obvious, this one is not going to go unnoticed. Not subtle. It's the least common form of disengagement, thankfully, but it's worrying because it has the potential to impact not only the learning of the student who's doing the disrupting, but everybody else in the environment as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that one was, obvious. But there were 2 other forms of disengagement that the teachers spoke about. One is avoiding, and this is when students are intentionally trying to find ways to get out of doing the work. As a teacher, we know that students have a number of ways that they do this. I need to go to the toilet. I forgot something in my bag. I need to get a drink. I had a kid that used to, when I was teaching early primary, sitting on the floor doing something, and then they'd go back to their desk to do the work. And, instead of making a direct line to his desk, he took the most roundabout way, around all the classroom to the desk,
And 3 kilometers later, 15 laps of the classroom.
Yeah, exactly. So, this is a familiar thing for many teachers. And then probably the most worrying form of disengagement for me is this passive form of disengagement, this withdrawing. This one is this is when students are intentionally trying to fly under the radar and go unnoticed. Is invisibility by design. They're often quite successful at it because they don't pose an immediate threat to the classroom. They do often go unnoticed. And it's the reason why I find it so worrying, 2 reasons, really. One is we know from the research that it doesn't really matter which form of disengagement the student chooses. The negative impact on their learning is the same. Students who passively withdraw from learning do just as poorly on average as students who are more actively disengaged. So, and then the other reason why I find it so concerning is the prevalence of this passive disengagement in our classrooms. Teachers in one study reported this is a daily challenge that they face. And certainly my conversations with teachers in schools currently, especially coming out of the pandemic, this is a real problem, And for
the listeners who don't realize what Melbourne went through, it was at one stage the world's longest lockdown with over 300 days of the strictest lockdowns in the world. And our students weren't going to school for nearly 2 years. And the ability to engage them after that has been, and part of why I think this is such a timely topic is because this is on the minds of every teacher right now, and every concerned parent and community member is wanting to re-engage their students. So this is why a vital topic. So sorry to interrupt. Continue on.
No, that's absolutely fine. So, I mean, as you can imagine, when you're learning online, and anybody who's had to learn online or had meetings online or, whatever, it's really hot. It's really easy to withdraw.
Yeah.
I mean, mute my microphone, mute my camera, and I am under the radar as much as I can be,
Yeah.
So,
but you've logged in, Amy. You've logged in. That means you're here, right? That means you're engaged. It's the equivalent to the student sitting on the chair being compliant, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. One of the just to expand on that notion of passively disengaged. So you have this quote in your book that I came across because I thought passively disengaged. Am I getting the sense of an oxymoron in here? But then I read this passage and I was like, oh, this makes so much sense. So let me just read this quote to you. You've said that in the introduction, disruptive students who actively demonstrate their disengagement and disenchantment with school are the most visible, but they are merely the tip of the iceberg. Less visible, but no less concerning, is the large number of students who are passively disengaged and disconnected from learning at school. They choose this path for a number of different reasons, but the result is the same. They fly under the radar on a pathway that limits both their potential for learning and their ability to thrive at school. And that's when the light bulb switched on for me. Okay, I see what you're saying there. And so this is the thing. So there's those two concerns that you raised. This is very prevalent, and certainly in the aftermath of a pandemic, this is a huge priority. Huge priority. We can't even start to think of learning unless we kind of pay attention to how to fix this problem.
Absolutely. And I think it can go unnoticed so easily. And because the students are behaviorally compliant, they look like they're engaged if you don't know what you're looking for. Because they might look like they're paying attention, they might look like they're listening, they might look like they're on time. There was an old saying, or like a bumper sticker or something that said, quick, act busy, Jesus is coming, this is like, when I think about that, I always think about things that happen in the classroom where these students will just be doing nothing. But if the teacher comes nearby, they know enough to pretend like suddenly I'm looking at my book and I'm reading something or I'm writing something. Like they don't want to go noticed. So anyway, they're very skillful at doing this and going unnoticed, but they are emotionally and cognitively checked out of learning, and that's obviously not good. Despite
the behavioral facade of being engaged, they are passively disengaged. Yeah. And so there's this distinction now in my mind between the actively and passively disengaged, and certainly I can see how much more insidious it is to be passively disengaged because you certainly don't reach the radar of the teachers as easily and obviously. Let's move up the other end of the continuum and expand on what the happy, fun, inspiring part of engagement. Let's talk about that.
Okay. So just like disengagement, engagement has three forms, and they too range from passive to more active. So just on the other side of the fence from withdrawing, we've got participating. This is when students they're basically following instruction. They're doing what they're told. Tell me what to do and I'll do it, kind of thing. So they're compliant. They're turning things in on time. They're on task. They're paying attention. If you ask them a question, they will respond. And unfortunately, this is the ceiling for engagement in many classrooms.
Yeah.
This is not the entry level. This is the top level. And that's worrying. And I'll come back to that in a minute about how this message has gotten through to students as well. But beyond that, we know as teachers that there's more than that. We are able to recall times when students are more engaged than that, even if it's not what we planned for. So when students are more engaged, the next level along is investing. This is when they are demonstrating signs that they are interested in what we're learning, that they are curious. They're asking questions, not about the task, tell me what to do and I'll do it kind of questions. They're asking questions that are designed to take their thinking deeper or take their learning. Right? So different kind of question. And they're really excited about sharing their ideas and their opinions and their insights and their discoveries with other people. This is where we start to see more of a connection with other people over learning.
So this speaks to this. Often this term social constructivism is bandied about in academic circles among educators as the gold standard of approaches to teaching. And I've often struggled with that term, and we won't go into that. But at the same time, I can see how it assumes a level of engagement on part of the students to be able to socially construct and co-construct knowledge with other students in the classroom and with the teachers. It assumes some level of the willingness to invest in the conversations, in the questions with one another. So it's an interesting one. It probably highlights necessary but insufficient condition for social constructivism to flourish in a classroom setting, if that's other people's perspective there. But there's one more. What's the highest level? Where's the high benchmark here?
At the highest level is driving. And this is really when students this is when they're most active in terms of engagement. This is when they have a clear and personally meaningful goal in mind for what they want to achieve. So I'm not talking about the teacher said, your goal is to do this. This is something that they have for themselves, some sort of, growth or improvement that they want to make in what they're doing. And they also have a plan for how they're going to achieve that. So some sort of plan in place for how they're going to do that, steps that they're going to take. They actively monitor their progress along the way. They actively seek feedback from other people, not the kind of feedback that says, am I done? Did I get it right? But the kind of feedback that says, how can I do it better? Have you got some ideas about how I can make improvements? And they're often actively collaborating with each other to further their learning.
Yeah, I'm actually really grateful that I've had a lot of great experiences with my students. At the tertiary level, I think there's often a selection filtering process where you end up with a lot of those actively engaged students. Although I have to say right now, engagement is a huge challenge for tertiary education as well. Getting students to show up to class when they're not obligatory is a huge challenge. And you will see memes going through Twitter with lecturers who are world-class Nobel laureates even have got pictures of themselves standing in front of an empty lecture theatre with students not there at all. And part of this is the fact that they've got the contingency of watching the online recorded version. Yeah. But at the same time, when you look at the number of students who actually watch those things and then the subset of those who watch them in full, you're looking at 15% of students watching them and maybe 5% of students watching those in full. So we have this challenge in the tertiary sector that I think is a greater challenge than we've ever had before to engage our adult students as well.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Now, when we think about the primary and secondary space, I always think about the work of Mary Kennedy, where she talked about 5, persistent and pervasive problems of practice that teachers face.
I love the alliteration there.
Yes. One of them is around engagement, trying to get students engaged in learning. And as she said, the problem comes about because although we can force students to be at school to some degree, and when we're talking about primary and secondary, we can't force them to learn while they're there. We certainly can't force them to be engaged in learning while they're there. And so it's actually the students themselves that have the choice to make about whether they're going to engage and to what degree they're going to engage. And so she goes on to say that they have 3 options available to them in response to this forced captivity. One is that they can choose to actively engage in learning. Another one is that they can choose to just be passively compliant and go along with what the teacher wants them to do. And then the other option is to, disengage and choose, no thanks, not for me kind of thing.
Right.
So it's an interesting, I always think that's an interesting thing. Now, the tertiary sector, it's a different game, isn't it? We don't really force them into this forced capacity,
and that's the thing. And you think you would assume a level of intrinsic motivation driving these students who are paying sometimes enormous fees to get a university degree and to get qualifications in a very competitive space in terms of, the job market. But it doesn't always pan out that way. So it's a challenge.
Think about where they've come from. A lot of times, our most successful students in school aren't highly engaged. They're just really good at playing the game.
Right.
And they often don't get much farther than participating.
Fascinating. There is so much assumptions there around the trajectory of students who excel in the secondary years. And you are touching on the point of why that doesn't always translate into success in the tertiary adult education settings. Let me ask you this question. What is the Jenkins curve and why does it matter for educators?
Okay, so the Jenkins curve, and if anybody's seen John Hattie speak, you might have seen him talk about it. It's something that he refers to a lot in his presentations often. And Lee Jenkins surveyed over 3,000 teachers, and he asked them two simple questions. One is, what grade level do you teach? And the other one is, what percentage of your students love school? And the results were and are pretty grim. Basically, students fall out of love with school from the minute they enter school. So I think there is a persistent misconception that somehow teachers in the early years, and I was one of them, know what we're doing, and our kids love coming to school. The problem is much later on.
So it's your fault. You're the ones who beat the engagement out of them. You
certainly put them on that path.
Thank goodness I've got a scapegoat here.
And of course, it's higher, in something like kindergarten, but you can see from the downward trajectory is, as I said, pretty grim. And it kind of bottoms out around year 9. I think from memory, something like 37%. And then maybe a slight improvement as they see the finish line.
So is that 37% have the love of learning?
Yeah, love school.
Love school. Love okay, school. So 37% by the time they get to sort of the middle adolescent years.
Yeah,
love school.
I mean, anybody who's worked with year 9s would go, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I can say when I worked in the naughty kids room, it was a high level of year 9 students coming through my door for sure.
Responsible thinking room, don't you mean?
Sorry, no,
yeah, that's right.
Classroom,
yeah, that's right. That's right. Oh, wow. So this is incredible implications, because what's happening is the love of school is at its ebb when we would hope these students are gearing up to peak in their love of school and their love of learning, because the implications for self-directed learning, self-regulated learning, and the level of engagement that is expected of them only goes up from there. Yeah. So how do we handle that?
Well, I mean, I think what's worrying, and, this research is consistent with a lot of other research that's out there around the declining rates of engagement and rising disengagement as students move through our school system. So as an education system, we're not very good at making schools places that students want to be at.
Right.
And his research was about loving school. I mean, there are plenty of kids that go to school because they like the social aspect of it. Yeah. But imagine if we asked them about loving learning. They would be much, much worse results.
Call it the berry curve. It's basically a flat line.
I'm not sure I even want to ask that. It's so scary.
Hey, I'm up for it. Let's try it.
Yeah. I mean, it would be interesting. It would be interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so that's interesting that it's also corroborated and triangulated against other research, because one of the potential criticisms of that curve would be that what we subjectively report differs markedly from what is objectively true in the world. And we know that is, of course, often what happens with research, that self-reporting doesn't corroborate objective findings. But in this case, you're saying it does. So in terms of what role schools play in that, surely there's a kind of developmental trajectory as well that's feeding into that, the sort of natural progression of a student's tendency to place higher priority on the voices of their peers. They're sensitized to social cues. Once you hit mid-adolescence, your hormones are raging, and your social group and impressing them and your standing in that hierarchy becomes vital, and sometimes can take precedent over your learning. So do you feel like that does have a role in this, or do you feel like we can say that the school environment, the responsibility still rests with the school environment because they should understand those developmental needs and therefore accommodate them? Or do you feel like that's a losing game?
I don't feel like it's a losing game at all. I think, we need to do better. Yes, to understand our learners and developmentally the challenges, but also the opportunities for working with different year levels, different
Absolutely.
year levels, so not just coming at it from a deficit perspective of, year 9 students. And I know I was a little bit flippant before, but, too often students of this age are, we speak of them terribly. Like, it is this real deficit narrative when it comes to talking about teenagers often, rather than, and they know this, they feel it, they experience it. And so, rather than thinking about what they have to offer and the opportunities for supporting them to really get this love of learning and get into learning and be successful, we often come at it from a very deficit lens.
And everyone loses. They lose out, we lose out. I think there's a push now to go towards a strength-based approach. At least there's an appetite for it, probably born of the recognition that the deficits model is leading to everyone losing, and people have become more cognizant of the possibilities of having a system where everyone wins, and the system that's not just a one size fits all for everyone, but does accommodate those different developmental needs.
Yeah. We need to change probably more than the kids need to change. We, unfortunately, I feel like we often just dig our heels in and battle. We go into battle mode when it comes to these things, and it just doesn't work. So we know from research, like even down at the level of the individual teacher in a classroom, when they're faced with a student who is visibly disengaged, more often than not, they revert to very controlling practices, even if that's not their normal way of doing things.
The command and compliance model is all too tempting in those contexts, isn't it?
And it doesn't work. It makes things worse rather than better. And so, this is the problem, becoming aware of our patterns of, shifting into battle mode, which is just not going to work. And then this whole thing about engagement being wrapped up more in behavior management and compliance than learning. Is a challenge as well.
Yep. And it's you're shooting yourself in the foot. You're aiming for compliance in order to help students learn, but when in fact you're undermining their learning. So, everyone loses.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned in chapter 2 of the book, and let me just read this quote back to you and get your impressions on it. Students walk into classes with enormous reserves of motivation. Their interests, passions, capacity for curiosity, and natural inclination to connect with others, to name a few, but many did not want to spend these resources on schooling. Our role as teachers is to turn these resources into fuel for learning so that students want to invest effort and energy into their work at school and enjoy the success that comes from that effort. This is a major point of engagement. It is less about pushing and pulling them in the direction we want them to go, and more about making learning the pathway they want to be on. It is steering these rich resources to the tasks most likely to have them investing and driving towards success in lessons. So can you just elaborate on that passage a little bit in relation to how teachers can facilitate students to be investing in and driving their learning in class?
One of the I call them roadblocks to improving student engagement. And one of them is this, traditionally, the work of student engagement is seen as secret teacher business, I call it. So it's the responsibility of the teacher to basically push and pull the student in the direction that they want them to go. So we got to hook them in, we got to grab their attention, we got to capture their attention, we got to get them engaged, we got to keep them engaged, we got to re-engage them. And that kind of language suggests that students are just passive pawns in our little game, and we're just moving them around the way that we want them to go. But as we've said before, that's not the reality. The reality is that it's the students themselves who make the ultimate choice about whether they're going to engage and to what degree they're going to engage. So it's a weird situation that we find ourselves in. So the first thing that we need to get our head around is that rather than battling or thinking that we have the total responsibility for student engagement, we need to think about how we can join forces and collaborate with the students themselves around engagement in this work of engagement. So bring them in on it. So, that's the first thing that we need to think about. How can we build this partnership approach rather than battling? And that traditional approach is only going to get us so far. It usually around about participation is about where it's going to get us. The traditional approach often squashes these natural motivational resources that kids come in with. So things like creativity, it stamps out creativity in favor of doing it the right way and getting the right answer in the right way that I've taught you. So creativity really suffers as kids move through school because we don't foster it. And then, also things like, curiosity and wondering. We're trying to squash that out as well. And then we're disappointed when students take the attitude of, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. When schools come to me and say, our students are really compliant, passive. But we made them that way.
We created this very monster.
So that's one thing we have to get our head around. Now, in terms of trying to, I guess, ignite these motivational resources and support them, it's about doing daily things like seeking regular input from the students themselves, finding out about their interests and their ideas and their passions, the things that they wonder about. And being prepared to act on the input that we don't just do it because we're ticking a box. I did that. I asked them for their input and I don't do anything with it. So we mean it. And we need to act in ways where we communicate to students that we value them, that we're interested in them, and that we believe that they are capable, everyone capable of being highly successful and effective drivers of their own learning.
Yeah, you're really speaking that self-efficacy into them.
Yeah. And the other thing is we need to look at the culture within our classrooms and within our schools because many times the culture itself is not conducive to high engagement. We need to, and this is why I often say, this is not about tinkering around the edges. When I talk to teachers often want, tell me, they're in the mode of tell me what to do and I'll do it. They want quick fixes. They want, give me the strategies. I'm struggling. Tell me what to do. And that's not what's needed. We have been tinkering around the edges of student engagement for decades. It doesn't work. It's not working. We need to transform the way that we think about engagement and the way that we do the work of engagement in schools. And that's going to take time. So building a culture for high engagement is one of the things that we need to invest in and spend time doing. And I'm talking about things like valuing challenge and risk-taking and, and I know many of your guests have said this before, but welcoming failure as an opportunity to learn. Valuing hard thinking, not just getting the right answer, creative thinking together. So that we move from this culture, this performance culture of doing, to a learning culture that is about thinking.
Yeah. And this sparks what I was going to say before. The idea of learner profiles has become quite popularized lately because it takes this broader perspective, this multidimensional perspective of learners. And I think it's really going to catch on in the next 5 to 10 years, where you're starting to see that students themselves, when you simply represent their school outcomes on the basis of one thin line of performance, academic performance, you say to them, I don't care about, you either implicitly or explicitly say to them, I don't care about everything else that you are and what you bring to this classroom, because this is what matters, because it's all we measure. And we measure what matters. And that self-perpetual cycle continues. And that can be very disengaging and disillusioning for some students. And these learner profiles provide an opportunity to then provide a map all of these strengths that students bring to the table and their interests. And this is what you were saying before, is if you actually listen to them and you build a learner profile, either doing it explicitly through some kind of software or whether you just write notes down on each student, but you are building your own mental model and map of who this student is, knowing your learners and how they learn, but knowing their interests, knowing what drives they have, what motivates them, and using that to scaffold your learning and teaching can be incredibly effective. But it also tells the student that I value things about you that aren't just about book smarts. I value the whole person who walks into this classroom, and you are welcome to be that whole person, that multi-dimensional person. And that can be very freeing, very liberating, and very encouraging for a student.
Yeah, because
Certainly. Sorry, go on.
There's space then for everyone to be successful. We haven't
Yeah.
narrowed what it means to be successful and valued in this classroom. There's space for everyone. Now, I would take the learner profile idea even further and say that my goal would be to have students create their own profile of themselves as a learner. Because what we want is, yes, I need to understand each of my learners at a deep level to be most effective. But what I really need is for them to understand themselves as learners, because I'm not going to be with them forever. They're going to move on from me. And my job is to equip them with their own understanding and skills to be effective drivers of learning beyond me.
To make yourself redundant.
Yeah. So I love the idea of, and I'm talking about practical things, not just airy-fairy, isn't this a great idea? Practical things that you can do to teach children about engagement, teach them what it means, teach them how to do it, teach them about motivation, their own motivation, get them to recognize their patterns of engaging and disengaging, and all of these things. It's really important. It's an important skill. Some would say it's a soft skill. I don't think it's a soft skill. I think it's vital. But yeah.
Okay. So this is good. We've now got a bit of a smorgasbord of things we can do, which brings us to this more nuanced perspective here. And you mentioned this in chapter 3, that research tells us that teachers are pretty good at determining if students are engaged or disengaged during learning, but less effective at deciding what to do about it.
Yeah.
So how do teachers decide on which of the strategies that you've mentioned are the most appropriate to use when they notice that their students are becoming disengaged with their learning?
Okay, so I think it's important to check in with ourselves as teachers and know our limitations. Now, we know from the research that teachers are actually pretty reliable and pretty accurate when it comes to monitoring and identifying certain aspects of engagement. And these are the more visible, aspects of engagement. Are they on task? Are they following instructions? Are they paying attention? Teachers are pretty good at monitoring that. But where we're not so good is the more internal aspects, what the students are thinking and feeling. And so we need to know our limitations as teachers about what we can reliably evaluate and monitor just with our own observations. But the good news is, when we're in a partnership with students, now we've got a buddy who is actually well placed to monitor those aspects of engagement that we're not that good at monitoring. So we buddy up and we partner and we teach them how to monitor their own engagement and feed that back to us. And so that's where the partnership really comes in. Now, when it comes to deciding on what strategies to use, again, we have to do this in collaboration with our students. It's not secret teacher business anymore. This is open, explicit, and we make these decisions together. Now, if we're talking about strategies to address disengagement, the most important thing that we need to do is not just identify that they're disengaged, but to get to the bottom of why.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love the idea of partnering with the students there as the first port of call to either re-engage them or have them investing and driving their own learning. Because, again, this really, I think sometimes we skip that link in the chain. And we hope that we can achieve the same outcomes despite the fact that all too important link in the chain is missing. And it's not, you can't get there. Yeah. You have to have partnership with these students. And what you're saying about making our agenda explicit with these students and having them partner and come on board with that can apply to all manner of things, I think, in the classroom. Too often we assume there is that assumed knowledge that you're talking about, and the students need to hear it. They need to hear, hey, what's the learning goal that you've got today? What do you, and even as teachers, we need to say, this is what I'm struggling with. I'm trying to achieve this with the learning outcomes today. Yeah. And I'm struggling with X, Y, and Z. How can we get there together? Let's partner together. Can you speak a little bit about what you mean by redefining the rules of engagement for students who might have become deeply entrenched in poor patterns of behavior? So these are the students for whom teachers may roll their eyes and try and get onto compliance regimes and put into the naughty corner or into these responsible thinking courses. And correction plans. How do we deal with those students? How do we re-engage them?
When we're talking about partnering with students and bringing them in on the work of engagement, when we're talking about extending our expectations beyond participating into more active forms of engagement, we're talking about shifting the goalposts. And some students will be happy with that and, be excited by the opportunity to be more engaged. And some students will actively resist our attempts to shift the goalposts for a number of reasons. I'm thinking about students who are very successful at the current game and the current rules of engagement that are around compliance and being busy doing stuff and,
ticking boxes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And they're really good at it. So, we have to understand that we're asking them to work harder, put in more effort, take more risks, and probably fail publicly, maybe. People often don't like to do those things willingly. So we have to be patient. I think firm in our raised expectations about what we expect in terms of engagement, but also patient.
You're playing a long game.
Yeah, people are going to take this path at their own pace sometimes.
Yeah.
So we need to acknowledge that's one thing. And in terms of kind of disrupting these patterns, I think the first thing is to help the students to become aware of their patterns. And we do this by getting them to check in on their engagement at different points during learning, to reflect on it, to communicate about it, have discussions about it, so that they become aware of their natural patterns of, let's say you've got someone who has a natural pattern of just turning off mentally and going into withdrawal mode the minute that the teacher, starts talking for more than 10 minutes. It's like, you've lost me, I'm done.
What have you just been saying the last 30 seconds? Say what? You've lost me. Oh, sorry. Yeah, back on track.
It's I think we can have a little bit of fun with this. Too often disengagement is treated like a criminal act in our schools and in our classrooms. And part of it is because
I sentence you to 2 hours in the naughty room.
That's right.
Disengaged.
That's right. So because it's wrapped up in behavior, I can see how it happens. But we need to.
But you're saying the behavior is actually just the symptom, right? But what you're looking at is root causes here, and this is why you're saying asking why and discovering why is so powerful in how to solve these problems. Yeah,
let's approach it with some curiosity and wonder. As a collaborative problem solving.
Well, here, speaking of problems, you mentioned this distinction between problem students and students with problems. Why is that kind of framing around the notion of engagement so powerful and important to distinguish between those two things?
Because, as I said, it is often, there is a stigma attached to being labeled disengaged or to being disengaged. If we think about students who are flying under the radar, they don't want to be noticed. And one of the reasons they don't want to be actively seen to be disengaged is, it's not a good thing. I'm being a bit silly saying it's a criminal act, but it's very negative. And so students who have a pattern of regularly disengaging are often labeled in classrooms and in schools. And those labels are with them for years. And so it's easy to do. We say things like, "Oh, Luke, he's never prepared. I always have to nag him to get anything done.
Sends the wrong calendar invites."
So we approach it with this very deficit view.
How do we avoid it though? Like, how do we avoid that problematizing of students?
One is to be aware of any habits that we have of doing that. And all of this is not just about changing students. This is more about changing ourselves as educators and hoping the students will join us on this journey as well. But, we need to challenge ourselves to, if we fall into that pattern of even thinking, "Oh, that kid again, like he never is." Okay. Oh, that's a red flag for myself.
You catch yourself mid-sentence and all of a sudden your self-awareness is driving change.
So we need to approach this as a problem-solving exercise. It's not somebody I've got to try to fix. it's a problem. It's a challenge. I mean, to me, it's like detective work. I love this kind of stuff because it's like detective work. And maybe I've been working in the field of learning through play for too long that I
Do you put that on your job title? Detective of Engagement and Learning, Amy Berry.
I mean, and that's where I think we can hook, and I don't want to use that term, but we can get kids to be into this kind of work when we have a bit of fun with it. So let's give them a scenario, and together as a group, let's see if we can put our detective hats on and get to the bottom of what might be happening for this student.
Well, I'm imagining it's because of our terrible teacher coming up as the root problem.
And you bring up a good point. We have to be willing to seek feedback on our own practice. Have a little bit of a thick skin and respond, use that feedback. Don't shut it down. We have to be okay with negative emotions when they come our way. It's natural. Disengagement is a natural human thing. It's not the fault of the person. I defy anybody to tell me that they have never been disengaged in their life. It's natural.
So what you're saying is this also applies to teachers as well. So they shouldn't problematize themselves. Even if a student says, I'm disengaged because of the way you're teaching, you can say, this is a problem to be solved. These are, I have a problem in front of me that I can problem solve in collaboration with my students, in partnership with them. But I am not a problem teacher. I am not the problem itself per se. And that's it's an important framing that goes both ways. Yeah, that's a really incredible insight there. Okay, we're on the home straight now. And this last section is a kind of fun section where I ask big questions and you give me a little answer. So a pithy 1 to 2 sentence response, whatever first comes to mind. Listen, we start off with this trivial idea of the purpose of education. So, Amy Berry, what is the purpose of education?
To empower and inspire.
Beautiful. Trademark that one. The most important change that teachers can make to improve their teaching is?
To never stop striving to be better.
Amen to that. The biggest strength of our teaching profession is?
Teachers. Their commitment, their creativity, their resilience, and their capacity to find solutions.
Agreed. The most important difference a teacher can make on the lives of their students is?
To believe in them.
Love it. The most important work being done in the field of educational research is?
I think work that builds a two-way bridge between research and practice. So not just a one-way research to practice, but this kind of collaborative bridge between the two.
Yeah. This distinction was made between knowledge translation as a one-way street and versus this knowledge mobilization where it's constantly and shared and open. So finish this or fill in this gap. If we keep doing blank, the education sector will be doomed.
I'm imagining that many people have said the same thing, but if we keep doing what we've always done.
Yeah, the hamster wheel. The hamster wheel of doom. If we keep doing blank, the education sector will be a huge success.
If we keep striving to create better experiences of learning for our students and our teachers.
Yeah, they'll want to come back for more. And that becomes a positive feedback loop, doesn't it? Okay, so now you've had a promotion at ACER. They've given you $1 billion to spend on improving the educational sector. How are you going to spend it?
I would spend it, we started off talking about this at the start, I would spend it on creating more opportunities for students to have a meaningful and powerful voice in the discussions.
Yeah, student voice and engagement seem to be closely coupled in your perspective there.
Yeah.
The most important habit a graduate teacher can cultivate is?
A passion for learning.
Oh, yeah. John Hattie mentions that the best teachers are also the best students. So I think that it's an important one that resonates with me and with a lot of people. The most meaningful change a school leader can make to improve the engagement of students in their school is?
To cultivate a culture of high engagement in learning within their school.
Yeah, so they're the culture makers, cultural architects, if you will. The most significant influence a person has had on your career is?
To have a vision of my work that went beyond what I thought was possible.
Right. And that's stretched your horizon of possibilities. And here we find ourselves having a podcast all about your book. And it's an exciting thing. I've really enjoyed our time together, Amy Berry. Thank you so much for being a guest on this podcast. And I'll have to get you back if you're willing.
Absolutely.
I hope you appreciated our discussion with Dr. Amy Berry as much as I did. After having this conversation and reading Amy's book, I feel like I've finally understood why Amy used the title Reimagining Student Engagement, because that's exactly what has happened to me. Her insights and expertise have deeply challenged my own assumptions about student engagement, and they've helped me to reflect on my own practices as an educator. One area in which I found myself particularly challenged was the idea that some of my students are passively disengaged from their learning. Amy mentioned in her book and in the podcast that these students are more likely to fly under the radar of teachers because they don't necessarily disrupt the learning of others, like those who are actively disengaged with their learning. Instead, they passively disengage by putting in minimum effort. They fail to ask questions. They don't interact with others. They watch the teacher with disinterest and coast along in the background of learning activities. Unfortunately, in doing so, however, passively disengaged students fail to reach their potential for learning, and their ability to thrive at school is throttled. Fortunately, there are ways in which teachers can turn this around and help their students become drivers of their own learning. They can have their hands on the steering wheel of learning and their feet firmly planted on the accelerator to forge ahead. Part of the solution comes from framing the notion of student engagement across a continuum, where students who are disengaged from their learning tend to withdraw, avoid, and disrupt classroom learning. While at the other end of the continuum, we have students who are engaged in their learning through active participation, through personal investment and passion in their learning. And then at its highest level, we have students driving their own learning by setting their own goals, actively seeking feedback to improve, relishing and even pouncing on opportunities and challenges to learn. They are also good at monitoring and evaluating their own learning because they become their own teachers. When I asked Amy how we could reach these lofty heights of student engagement in the classroom, one of the key themes that emerged is to partner with your students by first understanding some of the barriers that they might be facing that stop them from fully engaging in and driving their own learning. In this partnership, the teacher can learn more about their students' interests and what really makes them tick. And that knowledge can be used as a point of leverage in future learning. I also thought Amy offered some wise advice to those of us, including myself, who sometimes fall into the trap of problematizing their students. Amy emphasized that we've got to be careful to refrain from the temptation to attribute failures to engage in learning as a consequence of problem students, rather than as a result of students who have problems. This means that the issue of engagement is a problem to be solved, and not inherent in any student or person. And just one final insight that stuck with me was this playful idea of seeing ourselves as learning and engagement detectives so that we can problem solve with our students the mystery of how they can be better at engaging in their learning activities. We have a partnership in problem solving together. And in so doing, we promote a culture of engagement in the learning and success for everyone. If you're interested in exploring these ideas further, I recommend that you purchase a copy of Amy's book. You can find it on Corwin's website or by Googling the title Reimagining Student Engagement from Disrupting to Driving by Amy Berry. Now that's about all we have time for in today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to know more about the release of upcoming content or support this program, I'll include links in the show notes. Until next time, may you continue to learn powerfully.